nominalism is deeply problematic, and as you know, it's often identified even as the kind of main culprit for the turn towards the subject in modernity, for the destruction of metaphysics, the movement towards epistemology and so forth. And I mean, there's truth to that. That's undeniable. The historical context in which nominalism arose, however, was a different one, and very surprising to someone who perhaps, is not a medievalist and has not immersed himself or herself into this question. Nominalism arose as a reaction to what was regarded as an excessive Aristotelianism in the 13th century, which led to the famous condemnation of 1277. As you and I'm sure many of your listeners know, there was a famous condemnation of 219 or possibly 220 propositions that were condemned in 1277, because the Aristotelian movement, the influence of really pagan Greek philosophy on Christian theology, was by many regarded to have gone out of hand. And at the time, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas was regarded as being part of the problem, which is also interesting because our perspective on this has changed now. We regard him as somebody who was able to arrive at a balanced position. That was not really the opinion of the 13th century, where he was seen really as more of an extremist, so that one can actually show that part of the condemnation, several propositions in the condemnation, were connected with Thomas Aquinas' own works. And the condemnation was about this: are we destroying the eminence of God by making God merely a first cause who is intelligible in terms of natural philosophy? Natural philosophy now, philosophy as it is open to natural human reasoning, outside of grace, outside of the faith. That was the suspicion at the time. Along with, one of the problems was also the eternity of the world. That was the idea that the world could be eternal was condemned. It was among those. So among the condemned propositions in 1277. And nominalism then was a reaction to kind of safeguard the transcendence of God by claiming that, no, ultimately it is not possible for human reason to understand God's mind, because God is ultimately a person, not simply pure being or the first cause, but God is ultimately a person. And in order to understand a person, we have to understand will, because what is at the heart of a person is will. And therefore, if you want to understand God, we have to emphasize God's will. That leads then to voluntarism. Will, however, which remains ultimately inscrutable, because God's will is not something that can be logically deduced. That is the root of nominalism.
Wow, okay, so that's very
It is the root of nominalism that I don't deny. I mean, I'm trying to present it a little bit more sympathetically in order to do justice to where it came from historically. I don't deny that it then very quickly becomes very problematic. But that's where it came from.
So there seems to be a bit of a disintegration of theology, both in a conceptual sense, but also in a kind of what the sources that we're studying are. I mean, one question I would ask about that is, in rebelling against this Aristotelian wave, are they really someone like Occam, for example, William of Occam? Is he saying, well, no, let's return to the narrative of Scripture, or is this trying to get rid of this Aristotelian dominance? Do they end up making this flight even further into abstraction? Actually,
yes, but that's because he does both. I mean, so Occam will emphasize very strongly the distinction between faith and reason, and for theology emphasizes that the basis of theology is a reading of Scripture, where we will read God's will as it has manifested itself in history. And that is the study of theology, really. And then on another level, what we can do is we can analyze the terms that we use in order to talk about theological matters. And for that, we use reason alone. So that you get a dissociation of scriptural theology from logic. Logic becomes very untheological, even if it's brought to bear on theological matters. which is why contemporary analytic philosophers find a lot of interesting material in the nominalism of the medieval period, because even when a nominalist talks about God, or even talks about the second person of the Trinity, or talks about predestination, it's in very abstract and precise logical terms, such that a contemporary philosopher, even a totally secular one, can still recognize the structures of logical reasoning and just has to abstract from the theological material.
Yeah. Well, what strikes me about this in the history of theology is that you can't go back. So once all of these careful distinctions have been made by Thomas Aquinas, once the Greek wisdom has been brought in and these things have been kind of synthesized and these distinctions have been made, but also these elaborations of how God can be known from his creatures and things like that. You can't. What's striking to me is that the nominalists then didn't just return to this more simple, metaphorical, or kind of more. I'm looking
symbolic,
but also more integrated way of looking at things that happened before the scholastic movement. Instead of trying to kind of return to simplicity in a sense, they actually drive this even greater wedge in between they haven't gotten rid of the discussion of nature and of human things. It's like now they've driven this wedge between God and humanity in a sense, between God and nature, but there's no going back to just considering everything as sort of in this simpler light of, the virtuous person is the one who imitates Christ. It's like now we're going even further into the human mind.
Sure, absolutely.
In a way that's detached
true.
from
Yes.
from God.
Yes, you have a dualism then between, well, really that's what voluntarism is, between God considered from the point of view of his will and an attempt to think by means of logos, by means of reason, about creator and creation. Yeah.